American Anthropological Statement on Race. The myth of race in the U.S. still holds to be true, and that is why this statement, which was originally published on May 17, 1998, still resonates and still relevant today. And it could definitely be used to make sense of the misconceptions, prevalent confusions, and the pervasive presence of racism in the United States, even during recent times. The AAA Statement provides a historical perspective and sheds light on why scholars and the general public as a whole had come to see race as a normative and natural phenomenon, as categories as if they were integral to human societies, primarily because these categories were biological variations. Drawing on scientific knowledge, AAA statement makes it clear that human societies and their variations are not biologically determined or based, as once it was basically thought. They offer undeniable genetic evidence. As a matter of fact, over 90%, 94%. Evidence about physical variations found within different so-called groups. Interesting enough, they prove that there is only 6% variability in genes among and across different groups, highlighting even greater variation within rather than outside the so-called racial groups. Historically, different groups have mingled, they have interbred, and thereby sharing their genetic traits to create the humankind. Physical variations happen gradually over geographical areas. Physical characteristics or traits are inherited independently. Then, for instance, skin color would vary largely from light in the temperate areas in the north to dark in the tropical areas in the south, as the result of climatic changes. And this trait has nothing to do with other characteristics or basically traits. So race, unfortunately, has taken on social political meaning beyond physical variations, and this has been imposed by other human beings. Now, it is known as a fact that race was invented as a social mechanism in the 18th century to justify the conquest of Indian peoples, the subjugation of Africans who were brought to this country by the dint of force by the English and the Europeans, primarily using them as a source of cheap labor. So this social mechanism in the course of time was institutionalized and used as a classification system on a hierarchy to categorize people in a colonial situation, creating unbridgeable inequality between the enslaved populations and their masters. So race was used to justify the conquest and subjugation and retention of peoples, and in particular slavery during the 19th century. It created mental, institutional, and financial differences, and hence differences in rank and status. And such a status was normalized and even seen as a divine phenomenon, as different physical traits became markers of different types of identities and statuses. In other words, the myth of superiority and inferiority was created, linking better and superior traits with Europeans and American traits, and inferior ones to Indians and Africans. And then it was extended to other minorities. So race became a pervasive phenomenon institutionally, and was used to split and divide the colonized and the colonizers, to justify disparities, inequalities, injustices of all kinds: economic, intellectual, political, cognitive, and it created genocidal wars against Native Americans, the Nazis, for instance, against Jews in Germany, with extermination of millions of people, or anyone who was different. So brutalities were perpetrated throughout Europe and the United States. It is rightfully argued that race distorts human differences, as it uses biology and creates a non-existent homogeneity through suppositions about human groups and variations. And now we know that racial myths have no connection with capabilities. It is unfortunately paradoxical and tragic that racial beliefs became so deeply ingrained, and these myths became so institutionalized about human diversity, that most people lost sight of the fact that these so-called racial categories have become, were originally meant to be inventions whose ultimate purpose was the subjugation of other people. Now we know that culture is definitely something that is learned, that we are not born with culture in language or in culture, that we evolve and develop our dispositions or so-called habitus, identities in the course of our socialization into values which we consider to be our culture. All of us have the ability to acquire culture. We are all clear examples of how cultural and linguistic patterns of behavior are acquired, despite the fact that we may have variations. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, inequalities have persisted. The racial worldview has been perpetuated in the US, and it has not been seriously challenged and questioned in terms of who should have access to power and privilege. As AAA argues, the tragedy in the United States has been that policies and practices stemming from this worldview succeeded all too well in constructing unequal populations among Europeans, Native Americans, and peoples of African descent. And this myth still holds true, and only in recent years, as a matter of fact, in recent days in particular and months, this myth has come to be seriously questioned through initially a local and then a national and then a global movement against racism.